in the political structure, there was an eruption of hostility between the groups. But in those places, they really lacked that formal interfaith structure that you're recommending. They just didn't, there was a void. There wasn't anything to hold it together once there was a shift in the political leadership. So it's a really important lesson in our own country as well. I mean, post 9/11, my experience was in Massachusetts, where we had a formal interfaith structure in a particular community prior to 9/11. So when 9/11 occurred, we had an immediate method of responding and communicating with each other.
Yeah.
And so I've learned that personally, but I want to sort of highlight that recommended formal interfaith structure as a way to maintain harmony in the midst of adversity.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
Is it okay if I sit down? Like we're chatting.
Can you have a mic?
Do I need a mic? I'm speaking here.
Where's the mic?
Okay.
No, we're making sure you're heard on the podcast.
Oh, okay. Theologically speaking, it's fascinating to me how sort of similar and common the questions about the nature of God are among all these different religions. I mean, they're basic questions. They're basic questions about the fundamental nature of God. You know, the same issues of predestinationism versus free will get addressed, and if he's all loving and omniscient, you know, the evil problem. I mean, in Norcy's dialogue, is there anything that a Christian would find alien to their concept or understanding of the nature of God aside from the Trinity? I mean, aside from obviously we think that there are these three in one, and that doesn't violate monotheism somehow. Could you sort of theologically address it? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican friar of the 13th century, of course, gets credit for probably thinking through with enormous depth the classical idea of God, which, of course, is in the Summa Theologica, he explicitly acknowledges his debt to both, supremely, of course, Aristotle, which we're enormously grateful to the Islamic world for preserving that part of the Aristotelian corpus on which he drew, but also to Muslim theologians. I mean, it's quite clear, and to Jewish theologians, it's quite clear that Aquinas actually did learn from the conversations about divine simplicity, for example, from a Muslim theologian, which he then used in his own understanding of God. And David Burrell, in his excellent work, documents this, I think, superbly well. And so therefore that work of, okay, here we are, puny little creatures in a massive universe made up of billions of planets and solar systems and galaxies, trying to work out what the ultimate creator's like. There is something very healthy about recognizing that work should be done, drawing on a range of conversation partners across traditions. And I think that is actually sound Orthodox Christian theology, methodologically. I mean, Augustine of Hippo, I mean, what was his primary inspiration? It was Plotinus and Neoplatonism. And Plato, just to remind us all, wasn't exactly, a card-carrying baptized Christian. So we're all in the business of this, and the tradition always has been. And in one sense, carrying on doing that is an act of fidelity to Christianity. You're not betraying the tradition when you think in those sorts of ways at all. Norcy is very classical. I mean, he would, so divine immutability is there. I mean, it's a very, basically I think what's happened in the history of ideas when it comes to God, there are those which stress God's distance from the creation, and Norcy's in that school of thought. And those which stress God's closeness to the creation, the immanence of God, the immanence transcendence. And there are Muslim thinkers, actually, who talk in very radical ways about God's immanence in creation. So that conversation continues in traditions, across traditions, amongst theologians, and actually, those two differences are still very much there. I tend to think that the Trinity is an interesting one. I mean, Trinity is clearly a major issue in the Christian-Muslim dialogue. And that is I mean, but Christians often don't help here because we're not very good at explaining what the tradition claims about the Trinity. And I think we can and should be much more imaginative about that conversation. I mean, I think the most important, Thomas Michel, the Jesuit theologian, I think has been helpful here when he stresses that the dilemma that Christians face is comparable to the one that Muslims face. Both traditions said the eternal word must be eternal because God doesn't just arbitrarily start speaking. So for Muslims, that's the Quran. That's the eternal word, and it must be eternal, pre-exist creation, as you heard from Saeed Nursi and I quoted just a moment ago. Christians actually said the same thing, but we locate the eternal word not in a text, but in a life. And we then said the same thing. The eternal word must be eternal and pre-exist creation. And of course, the doctrine of the Trinity for Christians was the Christian way of safeguarding monotheism. So we wanted to make sure the eternal word and the creator are wrapped together. So we talk about God as triune, the eternal word aspect of God, the creatorial aspect of God, and of course the third person of the Trinity, that aspect of God that makes God present to us now, the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. Those three things, we didn't want three bits of God hanging around, so the Trinity was always the Christian way of hanging on to monotheism. While, and once you start talking in these sorts of ways, we face the same problem. This is how Christians solved it. I think that's a very healthy way to think through the relationship of to discuss the Trinity with Muslims. Are you chairing? Are you going to point to somebody, Karen?
Well, he had his hand up first. We're going to
And the mic's near you,
And the mic is near you,
Yeah.
yes.
Could you stand up, please?
Reverend Markham, I've been listening to you with great interest on almost everything you've said, but since I was born in India and grew up there, I was totally riveted about what you had to say about Indian Muslim-Christian Hindu relations. And I found your remarks to be extremely acute and bringing us to a point where we can proceed further in the discussion. I was raised in a Hindu background. I never felt very committed to Hinduism or any major aspect of it. And I went to secular schools, so-called, and even some Anglican schools where where we had house system and prefects and cricket games and so on. And Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, everybody on the same team. Our leg spinner was a Muslim, and I was captain.
Right.
And I'm rooting for England for the Ashes.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. We need the help.
One of the things, I just want to be very brief. The Hindus have this monopolizing tendency. You see, it's us, we Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, and other minorities, Sikhs, and all, we're all together. We're one nation. But those Muslims are the outsiders. And this is very analogous to the German situation where, everybody was one nation except for who, and let's go get them, you see. So the Muslims are unfortunately in the vulnerable position of being a minority under a very ugly seeming sometimes majority. And this is political and economic. You mentioned how the interfaith structures seem to lead to a peaceful atmosphere. Well, I would suggest there that there's an economic basis to that structure, which means that Muslims are already well represented with the Hindus because they're economically and in other ways culturally perhaps successful. Whereas where the riots break out and there are pogroms, to borrow a Russian word, it's not the case. And you have desperately poor and weak people on whom it's very easy to aggress. I wonder if that thesis will play, and perhaps somebody can work at it. I can't, I'm too busy. I have another very disparate comment, please.